A man lies dead in his London bedroom, eyes wide open, staring at a clock stopped exactly at midnight. No wound, no poison, no struggle, just an expression of being interrupted mid-thought, as if life itself had politely left him. The glass is warm, unsettlingly so, like skin that has only just finished breathing. Outside, the fog presses against the windows, muffling footsteps, swallowing the city in silence. This is not an ordinary death. Something has learned to wait, counting lives instead of seconds, and tonight, you will witness what it takes to feed it. The first body was found with its eyes open, fixed on a stopped clock. The hands were locked at midnight, perfectly aligned, neither trembling nor uneven, as if time itself had reached a conclusion and refused to proceed. The glass was warm to the touch, unsettlingly so, like skin that had only just lost its breath. In the fog-heavy streets of 18th century London, death was ordinary, expected, almost bureaucratic. Corpses appeared daily in alleys, cellars, boarding houses, pulled from the river or slumped beside gin shops. But this death did not belong to that familiar catalog. The man bore no wound. His lips were not blue from poison. His body showed no stiffness of struggle. He looked interrupted, not killed, as though existence itself had been politely but firmly withdrawn. The room where he died was modest, orderly, and painfully quiet. Curtains were drawn tight against the street fog, sealing the interior in a pale, breathless half-light. The air smelled faintly of metal and candle wax. The clock stood on a small table beside the bed, positioned carefully, deliberately, as if meant to be the last thing seen. Its case was polished, lovingly maintained, free of dust. Nothing else in the room seemed disturbed. No chair overturned. No sign of panic. Only the clock, and the man who had stopped at the exact moment it had. Word traveled slowly at first. London learned of deaths the way it learned of weather, with mild interest unless it interfered with routine. Yet those who handled the body noticed something that made their hands linger longer than usual. The man's eyes had not glazed over. They reflected light too clearly, too sharply, as though they were still doing the work of seeing. His chest bore no rise or fall, yet the impression remained that something inside him had simply stepped away, leaving the structure intact. The clock was examined briefly, dismissed just as quickly. It showed no damage, no flaw, no sign of mechanical failure. The gears were pristine, the balance true. It was, by every practical measure, a perfect instrument. Perfect, except for its refusal to move beyond midnight. When wound, it resisted gently, like a muscle that had already decided it would not obey. Outside, the fog thickened as evening approached, swallowing the street in layers of damp silence. Horse hooves passed without echo. Footsteps dissolved a few feet from where they landed. The house itself seemed to recede, becoming smaller, less present, as though embarrassed by what had occurred inside. Neighbors closed their windows earlier than usual. Candles were lit before dusk. Midnight approached unnoticed by most, but those awake at that hour reported an unfamiliar heaviness, a sense of pressure in the chest, as if the night itself were holding its breath. By morning, the body was removed, the room cleaned, the clock left behind. Yet the space did not recover. The air felt wrong, as if sound had been absorbed and not returned. Those who entered afterward found themselves listening too closely to their own breathing, to the pulse in their ears, to the faint internal rhythms normally ignored. Somewhere in the city, far beyond the reach of reason or explanation, something had aligned itself precisely with midnight, and London had felt it, even if it did not yet understand why. The clock had come from a narrow workshop wedged between a butcher and a shuttered apothecary, a location so unremarkable that most Londoners passed it without ever registering its existence. The butcher's windows sweated fat and heat. The apothecary's door never opened, its painted sign fading into the brick. Between them, the workshop seemed to shrink each year, its frontage darkened by soot and fog, its windows permanently dim, filmed with grime no hand ever bothered to clear. Even at midday, the glass reflected little light, as if the interior rejected the sun on principle. The door was swollen with damp, its wood split and warped, requiring deliberate pressure to open. Those who crossed the threshold noticed the smell first. Oil, old and sharp. Rust, metallic and sour. Beneath it all, something faintly sweet and wrong, like fruit left too long in a cellar. The air felt heavy, resistant, clinging to skin and clothing. Sound behaved strangely inside. Footsteps softened immediately. The scrape of a chair seemed to vanish halfway through the room. Even breathing felt muffled, as if the walls were listening and preferred restraint. The clockmaker worked behind a long bench scarred by decades of use. His movements were slow, deliberate, never wasted. He did not glance up when customers entered, not out of rudeness, but concentration so complete it bordered on devotion. His hands were thin and pale, fingers permanently darkened by oil and metal dust. He handled watches and clocks with the same care a priest might give to relics, lifting them gently, turning them with reverence, never rushing the inspection. Each object was opened, examined, dismantled, and cleaned as if it were a body laid out for ritual preparation. He spoke little, and when he did, his voice was low and neutral, stripped of curiosity. He asked no questions about ownership or history beyond what was mechanically necessary. Payment was modest, sometimes strangely so, as if money were an afterthought. What mattered was the work. Customers noticed this and adapted instinctively, lowering their voices, moving carefully, reluctant to disturb the strange equilibrium of the space. The workshop itself felt older than its surroundings, older than the city's current skin. Shelves bowed under the weight of clocks in various states of disassembly. Gears rested in shallow trays like sorted bones. Springs lay coiled with restrained tension, glinting dully in the half-light. On the walls hung diagrams drawn by hand, meticulous and precise, yet unfamiliar in their proportions. The designs suggested mechanisms that did not exist in common timepieces, configurations too dense, too symmetrical, as though intended to solve a problem most clocks were never meant to face. Neighbors had long noticed the pattern, though none spoke of it openly at first. Clocks repaired in the workshop behaved differently afterward. They did not merely keep time well. They kept it flawlessly. No drift, no hesitation, no uneven tick. Pendulums swung with hypnotic regularity. Pocket watches held their rhythm through jolts and drops that should have disturbed them. Owners remarked on the satisfaction, the quiet confidence of an instrument that never faltered. Some joked that the clocks seemed obedient, as though they had learned discipline rather than undergone repair. The final night always arrived without warning. The clock would function normally through the evening hours, carrying its owner through supper, candles, and sleep. Then, precisely at midnight, it would stop. Not slow, not stumble. It would halt, the hands aligned perfectly, neither ahead nor behind, frozen as if commanded. Those who happened to be awake described the moment as oddly noticeable, a subtle shift in the room, a sense that something had concluded. Those who slept through it never woke again. The workshop denied responsibility without denying involvement. The clockmaker never reacted with surprise when deaths were mentioned. He did not protest. He did not defend his craft. He simply listened, eyes lowered, fingers still stained with oil, as if the outcome had been anticipated but not celebrated. When authorities began asking questions, he cooperated fully, opening his drawers, allowing inspections, presenting his tools without hesitation. Nothing illegal was found. Nothing overtly dangerous. The mechanisms were immaculate, textbook perfect, even admirable. Experts admitted privately that the work exceeded most standards of the time. Yet something about the clocks resisted explanation. They showed no sign of forced stoppage, no broken tooth, no snapped spring. The energy within them had not dissipated violently. It had simply ceased, as if released elsewhere. The balance wheels rested in positions too exact to be accidental. Inspectors felt uneasy holding them, aware of a faint warmth that lingered long after motion had ended. At night, the workshop transformed. Neighbors lying awake in adjacent buildings swore the space did not sleep. Though every clock inside was still, something continued to move. A sound emerged after midnight, irregular and wet, too slow for gears, too uneven for any known mechanism. It did not echo. It pulsed. Some described it as ticking, others as a soft knocking, others as a rhythm closer to flesh than metal. The sound traveled through walls and floors, not loudly, but insistently, as if proximity mattered more than volume. Those who listened too long felt uneasy in their own bodies. Heartbeats grew louder. Breathing became conscious. Time seemed to stretch and compress unpredictably. Several neighbors began sleeping with lamps lit, windows open, anything to dilute the sense that the workshop was counting something beyond hours. Complaints were filed, then withdrawn. London was full of strange noises. This one simply felt too personal to describe. The clockmaker aged noticeably during this period. His hair thinned, then whitened. His posture bent forward, as if drawn toward the bench by gravity alone. Deep lines formed around his eyes, not from smiling, but from prolonged focus. He ate little, slept less. When seen in the street, he moved carefully, conserving energy, as though aware that every motion had a cost. Some claimed his reflection in shop windows lagged behind him by a fraction of a second, though no one admitted believing it. Despite growing unease, business did not slow. If anything, it increased. A clock that kept perfect time was a luxury, a promise of order in a city addicted to schedules and coordination. People ignored rumors when precision was offered in return. They brought their heirlooms, their gifts, their treasured instruments, trusting the quiet man in the narrow shop to make time behave. Each clock returned changed, refined, obedient. Each midnight drew closer with mechanical certainty. And inside the workshop, beneath the smell of oil and rust and that faint, cloying sweetness, the rhythm continued, steady and patient, as though something was being wound that did not belong to any clock at all. At first, the deaths seemed coincidental, the sort of alignment London produced without effort. The city swallowed the dead every day, quietly and efficiently, and the fog had a talent for turning chance into pattern. People died in their beds, in the street, in taverns and counting houses, and the city moved around them without slowing. One more corpse rarely demanded explanation. One more stopped clock meant even less. But coincidence weakens when repetition gains precision. The second death raised no alarm. The third produced a murmur. By the fourth, the pattern had sharpened enough to cut through denial. A banker, found at dawn in a townhouse that smelled of extinguished candles and cold linen. A midwife, collapsed beside a neatly made bed, hands still folded as if paused mid-task. A naval officer, discovered in a rented room overlooking the river, boots placed carefully beneath a chair he never reached. Different lives, different streets, different routines, but the same stillness, the same vacant interruption. Each body was intact. Each face carried the same muted surprise. Each clock had stopped at midnight. The city began to notice not the deaths, but the hour. Midnight had always been a boundary, a symbolic hinge between days, but now it carried weight. Watchmen reported an unease they could not name. Tavern keepers remarked on patrons leaving earlier, glancing too often at the time. Bells sounded heavier when they marked the hour, as if the metal itself resisted the task. People avoided looking directly at clocks as midnight approached, preferring to measure time by candle length or fatigue rather than risk witnessing the moment when motion failed. Authorities responded with methodical patience. Lists were compiled, names compared, addresses marked. What emerged was not chaos but alignment. Every victim owned a clock repaired within the same narrow window of months. Every repair traced back to the same workshop. The connection was undeniable, yet strangely inert, as if acknowledging it required more effort than ignoring it. Inspectors examined the clocks with professional skepticism. They disassembled cases, cataloged gears, tested springs, weighed pendulums. Nothing suggested tampering. No poison residue. No hidden blade or sabotaged tooth. The mechanisms were pristine, balanced with care that bordered on artistry. The energy stored within them had not been violently released. It had simply ceased to exist. The clocks had not broken. They had finished. Experts argued quietly among themselves, not over guilt, but over possibility. A clock stops when friction wins, when material fails, when energy escapes its containment. These clocks had done none of those things. Their components rested in positions too exact, too deliberate, as if guided to stillness by design rather than decay. Some described them as complete, a word more often used for documents or rituals than machines. As the list grew, so did the tension. Londoners began checking their clocks before bed with an anxiety that felt childish but irresistible. Those who owned repaired timepieces wound them obsessively, then hesitated, wondering if adding energy only hastened the end. Some covered their clocks with cloth before midnight, as if denying them sight might prevent obedience. Others removed them from bedrooms entirely, placing them in kitchens, hallways, anywhere the final moment might feel less intimate. The fog seemed to thicken during this period, lingering longer into the morning and returning earlier each evening. It dulled sound and blurred distance, turning the city into a collection of isolated pockets rather than a continuous whole. Movement felt slowed, not in speed but in intention. People hesitated at thresholds. Doors remained closed longer. Candles burned lower before being replaced. Midnight arrived not with drama, but with pressure. Clerks working late noticed the silence first. Papers rustled too loudly. Pens scratched with uncomfortable clarity. The absence of background noise made internal rhythms impossible to ignore. Heartbeats intruded. Swallowing became noticeable. Time, stripped of its familiar cues, felt unstable, as if capable of stopping without warning. Several men left their offices just before midnight, unable to articulate why they no longer trusted the hour. Those who investigated the deaths found themselves affected in subtler ways. Inspectors lingered too long over stopped clocks, fingers resting on cold brass as if expecting warmth. Sleep became shallow. Dreams grew repetitive, filled with imagery of halted motion. Pendulums frozen mid-swing, tides paused at their peak, breaths held indefinitely. Waking offered little relief. The sensation of being out of step persisted, as though something essential had been miscounted. Rumors flourished in the absence of explanation. Some claimed the clocks were cursed, carrying death like a contagion passed through metal and gears. Others whispered of foreign mechanisms, designs imported from places where time behaved differently. A few suggested divine correction, a judgment applied with mechanical precision. None of these theories satisfied, but each added texture to the unease, giving it language without substance. The workshop became a point of silent gravity. People passed it with increased attention, slowing unconsciously, as if proximity required caution. The windows remained dim, unchanged, reflecting only fog and passing shapes. No sign hung announcing closure or warning. The door stayed shut during hours it once welcomed customers, then opened unexpectedly, releasing a brief breath of oil and rust into the street before sealing itself again. Those who glimpsed the interior reported nothing overtly sinister, only a density that discouraged prolonged observation. The clockmaker himself remained cooperative, unremarkable, almost invisible in the growing tension. He submitted his work for inspection without resistance. He answered questions with factual economy. He did not deny the connection, nor did he affirm it. His demeanor suggested inevitability rather than intent, as if the outcome were a property of the work itself, not the will behind it. As the deaths continued, the city's tolerance for uncertainty eroded. Lists became maps. Maps became predictions. People began marking the dates their clocks had been repaired, counting days with a precision they had never before applied to their own mortality. Midnight ceased to be abstract. It became an appointment. What frightened London most was not the presence of death, but its discipline. Death that arrived on schedule felt unnatural, almost impolite in its exactness. It did not chase or ambush. It waited. It honored the hour. The clocks, perfect and obedient, seemed less like victims of malfunction and more like instruments fulfilling a final instruction. By the time officials admitted privately that the pattern could no longer be dismissed, the city had already adjusted its behavior. Midnight passed in rooms lit against necessity. Time was measured indirectly, cautiously. And in the narrow workshop between the butcher and the shuttered apothecary, the rhythm continued, unseen and unacknowledged, as though something beyond the city had learned exactly when to stop. Inside the workshop, the clockmaker aged faster than the city around him, as though London borrowed time from him without permission. His back curved incrementally, not from labor alone, but from a subtle inward pull, a posture shaped by years of leaning towards something that never answered back. His fingers thinned and lengthened, joints pronounced beneath translucent skin stained permanently with oil and filings. Veins stood out like fine wires. His eyes changed most of all. They grew reflective, polished to a dull shine, catching light without warmth, like brass handled too often and cleaned too rarely. Sleep abandoned him gradually, then entirely. Nights passed with his body seated at the bench, head lowered, hands resting near dismantled mechanisms he did not touch. When he did sleep, it came in shallow intervals measured not by dreams, but by physical necessity. The building did not rest with him. Even when the shutters were closed and the door bolted from the inside, the workshop retained a wakefulness that pressed outward into the street. Neighbors lying awake swore the sound began shortly after midnight. At first it was faint, easy to dismiss as pipes or distant machinery. But it repeated, night after night, acquiring texture. It was not the crisp tick of escapements or the steady pulse of pendulums. It was wet, irregular, uneven in a way metal could not manage. Too slow for gears. Too intimate. It carried weight. Some described it as ticking only because language offered nothing better. Others refused the word entirely. They said it sounded like counting, but not seconds. Something heavier. Something final. The sound did not echo. It absorbed the air around it, dulling other noises. Horse hooves passing outside seemed to falter as they crossed the invisible boundary around the workshop. Conversations softened involuntarily. Dogs whined and pulled against their leashes, refusing to linger. The butcher next door complained that his knives lost their edge faster, as though metal itself resented the proximity. He moved shop weeks later without explanation. Inside, the clockmaker worked with increasing intensity. His methods shifted subtly, away from common repairs and toward modifications few would have recognized as such. He replaced components that were not broken. He filed edges smoother than required. He adjusted tolerances until they approached impossibility. His notes grew denser, diagrams layered over earlier diagrams, each iteration refining symmetry beyond function. The clocks he returned to their owners bore no visible mark of change, yet something in them had been reoriented, disciplined toward an endpoint only he understood. Food went untouched. Plates accumulated in corners, bread hardened to stone, meat spoiled without being cut. He drank water sparingly, as if rationing fluid mattered less than conserving attention. His body adapted, thinning, slowing, conserving. He moved with the economy of something designed to last rather than live. At times, those watching from across the street saw light burning in the workshop long after the city slept. The glow was steady, neither flickering nor dimming, as if fuel were irrelevant. Shadows inside did not shift normally. They clung to walls, stretched too far, then snapped back into place. No silhouettes crossed the windows. The light existed without obvious source, illuminating nothing in particular. Those brave enough to enter during this period described an oppressive density in the air. Breathing required effort, as though oxygen had been replaced with something thicker. Sound refused to travel properly. Words spoken aloud felt unfinished, their ends cut short before reaching the ear. The clockmaker rarely acknowledged visitors. When he did, his gaze passed through them, focused instead on the subtle movements beneath skin, the involuntary rhythms people carried without noticing. His own heartbeat grew audible, not to others at first, but to him. It intruded during moments of stillness, pulsing behind his eyes, beneath his ribs, along his wrists. Rather than resist it, he listened. He adjusted his breathing to it, then adjusted the workshop to match. He sealed gaps. He layered materials within walls and floors, dampening resonance, erasing echoes. He created a space where only internal rhythm remained reliable. The sound neighbors heard evolved. It slowed further, deepened, acquired pauses that stretched uncomfortably long. The intervals felt intentional, as though waiting mattered more than movement. Those who counted the beats lost track quickly, their own hearts interfering, their bodies responding before thought could intervene. Several awoke in the night convinced they had missed something essential, a moment they were meant to witness but had slept through. The clockmaker recorded everything. His journals filled with observations not of clocks, but of himself. Pulse under exertion. Pulse at rest. pulsed during complete stillness. He measured durations without tools, relying instead on bodily awareness refined through deprivation. He wrote of alignment, of resonance, of the necessity of sacrifice. Not blood, not pain, but time. He wrote that time was not owned equally, that some possessed surplus while others starved, and that balance required correction. His reflection in polished brass surfaces began to trouble him. It lagged by imperceptible degrees, not enough to prove, enough to notice. Movements felt delayed, then too quick, as though synchronization required constant adjustment. He responded by working longer, refining further, eliminating inefficiency wherever he found it. He removed excess from himself as carefully as he removed it from mechanisms. Outside, London adapted without understanding. People slept less. Midnight became a pressure point rather than a passage. Lamps burned longer. Taverns closed earlier. Noise was cultivated deliberately, a shield against the sensation of being measured. The city did not connect this shift to the narrow workshop directly, but it circled the truth without touching it, like a tongue avoiding a sore tooth. Inside, the counting continued. It did not belong to any clock, yet it governed them all. The clockmaker felt it most clearly when he stood perfectly still, hands resting at his sides, eyes closed. In those moments, he sensed completion approaching, not as threat, but as resolution. Something had been promised. Something had been fed carefully, patiently, through discipline and precision. He no longer feared the sound. He had shaped it. He had given it structure. It followed him now, matched him, learned from him. The workshop had become less a place of work than a chamber of preparation, walls tuned to a rhythm older than gears and stronger than metal. The city aged around him, loud and inefficient, while he refined himself toward stillness. By the time neighbors realized the ticking had grown slower than any clock could tolerate, the clockmaker was already ahead of them, listening not for movement, but for the moment when movement would no longer be necessary. The truth surfaced not through confession, but through collapse. The workshop door stood open before dawn, swollen with gaping toward the street as fog rolled inside like a thing with intent. It moved low and deliberate, spilling across the floorboards, climbing the bench legs, erasing edges. Those who passed noticed the open door before they noticed the silence, a silence deeper than usual, stripped of the irregular rhythm that had haunted the street for months. Something had stopped stopping. The clockmaker lay at his bench exactly where he had spent most of his waking life. His body was upright, seated, hands resting palms down on the scarred wood as if he had simply paused mid-measurement. His mouth was parted slightly, not in pain, not in fear, but in recognition. His eyes were open, unfocused, reflecting nothing in the room despite the growing light. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned stool, no broken instrument. His death had not arrived violently. It had arrived precisely. Around him stood dozens of clocks, mantel clocks, wall clocks, pocket watches propped carefully in stands. They were arranged in a rough circle, not evenly spaced, but deliberately oriented. Every face turned inward, every hand aligned. Midnight. The stillness was complete, oppressive in its perfection, as if movement itself had been excluded by agreement. Inspectors later remarked that the room felt less like a workshop than a chamber, prepared rather than abandoned. The fog thinned slowly as morning advanced, reluctant to leave. Those who entered the space found their footsteps swallowed almost entirely. The air smelled sharper than usual, metal and oil layered over something unmistakably organic. The sweet rot lingered heavily now, no longer masked by habit. It clung to clothing and hair, followed visitors back into the street. Authorities approached the scene with the restraint born of unease. They touched nothing at first. The clocks intimidated them, not through threat, but through unanimity. Each one silent, each one exact, each one finished. When they finally began to examine the bench, the drawers, the shelves, they did so carefully, as if disturbing the arrangement might provoke consequence. The clockmaker's body revealed nothing immediately. No wound, no mark, no poison detected. His heart had simply ceased. The irony did not escape those present, though no one spoke it aloud. The man who had disciplined time had been reclaimed by it without ceremony. It was the pocket watch that unraveled the remainder. Found in his coat, heavy for its size, its casing scratched smooth by years of handling. Records showed it had not been serviced in decades. Yet when opened, it bore signs of recent modification. The components inside were immaculate, unfamiliar. Inspectors noted the wrongness instantly. Gears cut at impossible angles. Springs that did not conform to known metallurgy. And threaded between them, bound into the structure with terrifying intimacy, were fragments that did not belong to any machine. Slivers of bone, polished thin. Threads of dried sinew, twisted and tensioned with care. Organic material integrated not crudely, but reverently, as if the distinction between body and mechanism had never existed. The watch was warm to the touch, despite its stillness. It had not stopped from disrepair. It had been completed. Further discoveries followed quickly. Hidden compartments beneath the floor, panels within the walls layered with felt, lead, and substances not listed in any builder's ledger. Drawers filled with meticulous notes written in a hand that grew tighter, more economical over time. The writing no longer described clocks. It described alignment, resonance, exchange. The clockmaker had believed time was not a river, but a reservoir. That it accumulated, concentrated, required balance. Some lives burned quickly, others lingered inefficiently. The imbalance offended him. His work had never been about stopping time. It had been about redirecting it, nourishing something vast and patient that existed beneath measurement. The clocks were offerings. Perfect, obedient instruments wound to their fullest potential, then surrendered at the precise moment when energy peaked. Midnight was not arbitrary. It was the hour when resistance thinned, when the day released its grip. The deaths that followed were not punishment. They were payment. The owners were not targets. They were carriers, living conduits who unknowingly completed the circuit when the clocks fulfilled their function. The circle in the workshop told the rest. This had been the final arrangement. The clockmaker had placed himself at the center willingly, the culmination of years of refinement. His own watch had been the last to be prepared, the most intimate, built not merely to stop, but to bind. He had not been surprised at death. He had been recognized. Officials ordered the clocks removed. Some resisted. The resistance was irrational, visceral. Hands trembled when lifting them. Several inspectors reported nausea, dizziness, a sensation of being watched from behind the eyes. One dropped a mantel clock, shattering its face. The sound echoed too loudly, too sharply, as if the room resented interruption. Work continued regardless. Fear had become administrative. The clocks were catalogued, dismantled, melted down. Bone and sinew were separated and destroyed. The workshop was stripped to brick and beams. Even so, the smell lingered. Even so, the silence remained uneven, as though something had learned the shape of the space and refused to forget it. No official explanation satisfied the public. The narrative settled on eccentricity, illness, coincidence amplified by rumor. London preferred that version. It allowed life to continue without revision. Yet the hour of midnight did not recover its innocence. Lamps stayed lit longer. Clocks were wound with care and suspicion. Some people stopped owning them altogether, choosing bells, candles, anything less precise. The pocket watch was buried separately, sealed and documented, its location known to few. Those few avoided it instinctively, aware that its stillness felt unfinished rather than inert. Records note that even in storage, it resisted corrosion. Metal dulled around it, but the watch itself retained its strange warmth, as though holding something in reserve. The clockmaker's body was interred without ceremony. No marker described his trade. No inscription marked his contribution. Those who handled the burial reported a persistent sense of incompletion, as if something expected had not occurred. Midnight passed that night without incident, yet several people woke abruptly, hearts racing, convinced they had heard a final count begin and then stop. The truth was never announced. It did not need to be. It settled into the city the way fog did, altering behavior without explanation. Time resumed its forward motion, imperfect and jittering. But beneath it all, something had been fed carefully, methodically, over years of devotion. And now, sated but not gone, it waited, patient as ever, for the next precise moment when completion would once again feel necessary. The clocks were destroyed with an efficiency meant to resemble finality. Brass was melted into ingots and repurposed. Iron was buried beneath fresh earth. Wood was burned or broken down for lesser uses. Official records marked the matter resolved, the incident contained, the anomaly removed. London accepted the gesture of certainty because it needed to. The city had always relied on forgetting as much as it relied on memory. Yet rhythm, once disturbed, does not return simply because the instruments that marked it have been erased. Midnight changed first. It arrived without announcement, slipping into houses like damp through stone. People learned to feel it rather than measure it. Curtains were drawn earlier. Lamps were kept burning longer, their flames trembling without draft. Sleep fractured around the hour, thinning into restless half-consciousness. Those awake at that moment felt watched, not from without, but from somewhere beneath perception, as though the act of existing were being observed rather than the body itself. Clocks that had never passed through the workshop began to misbehave. Pendulums hesitated. Pocket watches lost seconds unevenly, then gained them back without logic. Repairs offered temporary improvement at best. Time moved forward, but it no longer agreed with itself. Appointments drifted. Bells rang early or late. The city adapted by instinct, loosening its reliance on precision. Markets opened when they felt full enough. Ships departed when crews sensed readiness. London grew imprecise, and with that imprecision came unease. The places closest to the old workshop fared worst. Though the building had been stripped and repurposed, its walls retained a density that resisted alteration. Sound behaved poorly there. Footsteps echoed too long or not at all. The ground floor tenants complained of pressure headaches and erratic sleep. Several moved away without clear reason, leaving behind rooms that refused to feel empty. The smell lingered faintly, metal and something organic that no cleaning solution could erase. Beneath the streets, the city's older structures absorbed the change. Sewers built in different centuries intersected like badly aligned veins. Moisture collected where it should not have. Rats avoided certain tunnels entirely, diverting their paths with unusual discipline. Workers reported hearing sounds that did not carry properly through air. Vibrations felt more than heard, slow and regular, followed by pauses too long to be accidental. Reports were filed, dismissed, forgotten. Time resumed, but imperfectly. It jittered, stumbled, corrected itself too late. The city lived with this new behavior as it lived with fog and soot, adjusting posture rather than challenging cause. Generations grew accustomed to the idea that midnight was a threshold best crossed unconsciously. Stories passed quietly, stripped of detail, reduced to advice rather than explanation. Do not wind clocks too tightly. Do not stare at stopped hands. Do not listen too closely when the city grows quiet. Those who did listen described the same thing. It was not ticking. It was not counting seconds. It was breathing. Slow, measured, patient. An intake that seemed to draw something from the air itself, followed by an exhale that left the space heavier. The sound did not repeat at regular intervals. It waited. Waiting had become its skill. The memory of the clockmaker faded in public record. His name survived only in brittle documents rarely consulted. Yet traces of his thinking persisted, embedded in how people spoke about time without realizing it. Phrases shifted. Hours were said to be spent rather than passed. Days were described as heavy or light. Lifespans were weighed rather than counted. Language adapted to accommodate a sense that time was no longer neutral, no longer merely a measure, but a substance with appetite. Occasionally, a death would draw brief attention. A man found seated calmly beside a clock stopped at midnight. A woman discovered in bed, eyes open, expression unreadable, her timepiece resting nearby, hands aligned. Investigations found no connection strong enough to pursue. London still swallowed the dead daily. Patterns were easy to imagine in fog. Officially, coincidence remained sufficient. Yet those who handled the bodies noticed familiar details. Warmth lingering longer than expected. Muscles relaxed rather than slack. Faces marked not by fear, but by interruption. The sense that something had arrived precisely when invited, not early, not late. The clocks involved were never remarkable. They were not masterpieces. They had not passed through any infamous workshop. They had simply reached a moment of alignment. The buried ingots corroded more slowly than expected. Soil samples taken years later showed anomalies no one could explain conclusively. The earth around them compacted unnaturally, resisting root growth, channeling moisture inward rather than dispersing it. Even melted, dispersed, forgotten, the material remembered its function. Completion, once learned, does not easily unlearn itself. Children born in the surrounding districts displayed peculiar habits. They paused instinctively at midnight, wherever they were, sometimes mid-step, mid-breath. Parents dismissed it as coincidence, as mimicry, as imagination. The children outgrew the behavior eventually, but retained an unease with clocks, a preference for light during sleep, an aversion to silence that lasted too long. They grew into adults who trusted intuition over schedule, sensation over plan. London endured. It always had. Fires, plagues, wars, and reforms reshaped it repeatedly, without erasing its core. This disturbance joined that long list, subtle enough to survive scrutiny, pervasive enough to matter. The city learned to live slightly out of sync with itself, a condition mistaken for progress by those who benefited from flexibility. Deep beneath the streets, in walls soaked with centuries of damp and death, something learned to wait without moving. It had been fed structure, discipline, and patience by careful hands long gone. It no longer required clocks to understand completion. It listened to the city instead, to pulses and pauses, to lives accelerating toward exhaustion or stretching thin with unused time. It adapted, as London did. Midnight continued to arrive. People continued to avoid it. Curtains remained drawn. Lights burned. Breathing slowed unconsciously as the hour passed. Most heard nothing. Some felt pressure behind the eyes or beneath the ribs. A few, those quiet enough, still heard it clearly, not ticking, not counting hours, but breathing, steady and restrained, patient and hungry, counting down not seconds or days, but lives, waiting for the moment when alignment would once again feel necessary.